So at this point in our presentation, the end of our symposium, when we do this roundtable, really our goal here is to try to take the things that we've talked about from the war and tie it back to the modern day and what we're dealing with today. So to get started, I think we can each of our speakers take about 5 minutes and just talk briefly about your talk, remind us a little bit about what you talked about and how it connects to the modern world, make that connection for us. And we'll start just in the same order we went. So Rich, if you would like to take it away.
Well, very briefly, I mean, the basic message I would convey with respect to the Asia-Pacific War is that it shaped the 21st century. It was instrumental in the rise of both China, the PRC, and also India, two of the dominant nations in the world today. South Asia today contains more than half the population of the globe, and all the countries and all the peoples of that region were fundamentally, their future was shaped by the history of that period. So that's, the bottom line, that's really what I talk about.
Was a little faster than we expected, but great, concise. So we'll pass it over to Dr. Lee.
Okay, I will make it slow. Well, that's pretty much as Rich said here. The Pacific War shaped current Asian politics, even in the 21st century. Like I mentioned during my presentation, China still has two governments. One's on the mainland China as the PRC, another on Taiwan as the ROC. The tension, the civil war struggle continued, also involved other countries like Japan and United States. So for the China, the nationalistic consciousness and the memory of the war continue. So today's discussion is very important, not only about the history, but also about China and Taiwan's future.
Okay. Hi, I'm Marie Vallejo. Well, I came here because of my book, Dauntless, and I do believe that we have to tell all these stories, and real stories about World War II. And so therefore this, my book has been an untold story of the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiment. They brought propaganda within the submarine missions that they came in, and the same thing then therefore that truth has to be told, propaganda should be truthful or not truthful, so therefore you have also counter-propaganda. And it's still happening today. You have all of this information and you have to call from them what are the lies and what's the truth. So that's my story.
Turn. I think the Asia-Pacific War is fundamental to understanding the security in the Asia-Pacific region today. That the same issues still remain. The reverberations of Japan's war crimes and unresolved apologies and unresolved reparations continue. The understanding of having to fight a fascist government and what happens when you have a fascist militaristic government. It makes people do really bad things. And one, in regard to what I talked about, basically it's the same old issue of sexual violence in conflict. It is not a natural consequence of warfare. It should not be. It can be prosecuted. And that's what came out of World War II in the Pacific. The first real trial was actually regarding the Dutch women. And it was only in 1948. And they only focused on 35 Dutch women that had been taken to brothels or comfort stations and convicted a number of Japanese officers. And this war crimes trial was the only documentation and the undergirding for all the kind of legislation and understanding after that. And again, there was no mention of rape until the Fourth Geneva Convention, and that was not till 1949. Even though there was something called the UN War Crimes Commission, which collected from the Philippines and China, India, all over the front, war crimes, and they considered rape a war crime. But these documents after the war were sealed and only came to where it took a lot of work from the US government and historians, and it wasn't until the late 90s, I think early 2000s, that they were unsealed. And you can see how all these crimes just did not get addressed. But now we understand a lot more about violence and warfare. We understand how to deal, how it should be. It's taken a long time on how we should confront it, how we should prosecute the perpetrators, we should keep the perpetrators responsible. And that's what makes it all the more baffling that the Japanese has slid backwards in terms of their recognition. Well, I hate to say the Japanese right-wing governments, the people who are making decisions, the people actually who we the U.S. government deals with. And something didn't say, the Japanese will say they've done many, many apologies. They've done 63 some apologies about the war. They've apologized to the comfort women. Well, part of it is language. Part of it is backsliding after they've said something. But the part of it that they like to bamboozle Westerners, particularly Americans, that there is a legal requirement. The National Institute for Defense Studies, a Japanese university, did a study of, well, what Japanese war apologies are official. I like to use the word unequivocally official. For a Japanese government document or declaration to be unequivocally official, it has to be approved by the cabinet. Only 4, and I would say 5, apologies have been approved by the cabinet. Not one apology to the comfort women has been approved by the cabinet. However, there are 2 cabinet decisions saying there was no cabinet-approved apology to the comfort women. They felt that it was so important to say that. That's pretty crazy. That's the technical academic word. And that's sort of shameful that we don't keep our foreign policy values are being trampled upon by the Japanese on this issue, particularly when we like to say it's a pillar of American foreign policy, and has been for quite a long time through I don't know what it was in the Trump administration, but before that in the Bush administration, Obama, now it is very important. So it is what happened in World War II is reflective of, and what's going on now is reflective of the unresolved issues. And just as the end, there are efforts throughout the Pacific to remember and recognize the comfort women. In the Philippines, they put up actually quite a beautiful statue on the walkway by Manila Bay, and close to, looking down on it was a hotel called the Bayview Hotel. The Bayview Hotel, during the rape of Manila, the Japanese soldiers, while they were rampaging, rounded up about 200, 300 girls and dragged them to the hotel, and it was a gang mass rape there. So there's this beautiful statue. It lasted about 2 weeks. The Japanese government sent a cabinet official to the Philippines and made them literally rip it out of the ground. So you gotta wonder, this is what the Japanese government is spending its energy on? This is our ally.
Well, thank you, each of you, for your summary there. So I hope for everybody here it's pretty clear that there's a pretty good connection between the modern day, the stuff that we've been talking about up here all day. And so at this point, we want to open it up to questions, both our in-person and our virtual audience. Just like all day today, if you're in person, raise your hand. I'll call on a mic runner. They're going to come up. Make sure you speak closely to the mic so that our virtual audience can hear what you have to say. And if you're in the virtual audience, just go ahead and shoot it in the chat box. So without further ado, do we have any questions?
Hello. This is kind of a devil's advocate position, but I don't want to completely escape any personal connection to it either. But there was a term that was developed in the, I believe in the 1960s. I believe it was by the German government, called Realpolitique. And the concept was, what's absolutely vital is your national interest. And that isn't just, that doesn't mean that there aren't complementary interests. There aren't things that are important. But with the absence of considering that either governments are stupid or governments are evil, there may be a understanding of what's most important is China, and that all other issues are subordinate to that point. Can you speak to that?
If you have, how can I say this? The Japanese conservative nationalist governments have had a difficult time trying to revitalize Japanese self-defense forces into a military. They need an enemy. Traditionally has been North Korea. The Japanese, and how powerful North Korea is, whether its missiles will really hit anything, do anything, it's always very effective. And now we have the Chinese building islands in the Pacific, which I don't know how much Americans realize. We have a bunch of islands in the Pacific. We just didn't have to build them. And we have outposts still throughout the Pacific. Some acquired from the Japanese, some have acquired from the Spanish. I think the Japanese, from what I see, are not as afraid of the Chinese as we are. And the Japanese know the importance of doing business with the Chinese. Yes, it's important to be wary. Will the Japanese go help Taiwan? We don't know. We just don't know. I think, I'm not so sure Realpolitique is, it's a nice way of talking about our relationship with Japan and Korea and what we're trying to achieve, but we still really are unsure what the Chinese are trying to achieve and how much pressure Xi is under. There's been some strange goings on in Beijing right now.
Yes, sir.
This is pretty straightforward, I guess. How does the difficulty of getting Japan to apologize for anything work with the concept of it is vitally important not to lose face or to maintain face? How do you work around that as a cultural phenomenon?
Well, probably the traditional ideology, philosophy for the ancient government, including Chinese, Japanese, and Korea. They believe the people was born pure, different from Christians' ideology. We have, carry on some, guilt or sin, so we can be a better person or better government later on. But in Asia, this opposite thinking, we will come, pure and good. So we try to protect the past. We did not make mistake, or just accidentally one bad guy take over, made mistake. We can't, talk too much about it, learn too much about from the accident. So very protective about their past. Not like mentioned, German government easy to draw the line and cut off the luggage of the past, but not easy for the traditional East Asian thinkers or policymakers. So they have to be very careful about their comments, assessment, even critiques on their past.
Let me just comment a little bit about that. I think when you're dealing with Japan, what we have is, as Mindy said, we have a very, from our perspective, a very backward-looking leadership on the nationalist political right in Japan, and their voices have been very loud in terms of their ability to project their views outside Japan. At the same time, there's sort of this submerged, I think the submerged majority of Japanese who don't really agree with that. And there's a deadlock within Japan over the Constitution, which was really written by Americans. And when the Americans wrote the Constitution, we just assumed that, of course, as soon as the occupation ended, the Japanese would, create their own Constitution. But the two sides of a dispute in Japan between the nationalists and the rest of the population are in this deadlock that's prevented that Constitution to continue in existence now since Japan regained its sovereignty. So our central problem is that, that submerged majority, which does not agree with what that right-wing nationalist government does, they simply have not been able to gain a voice and articulate it consistently to be described to the rest of the world what the real views of the real Japanese people are. And that's kind of, from my discussion with my Japanese colleagues, that's basically what they talk about all the time, is the difference between some of the elites and the general beliefs of the total population.
It has nothing to do with these ethnographic notions of faith and how the Asian people act or not act. They are political actors like anyone. So there has nothing to do why they don't apologize, and more important, have backtracked, where they were much more apologetic and much more understanding of the issue in the 90s. The issue is more about power and money, and how the ruling Liberal Democratic Party decides it projects its power. When you look at the Japanese cabinets for the last, I do an analysis of the cabinets since the Abe years, 85-90% of the cabinet are members of ultra right-wing groups. Not just, it would make the John Birch Society guys blush.
If what we're kind of discussing now is the connection between the war in the Pacific and current reality, I wonder, Dr. Lee, who's just written a book called China's New Navy, if you could kind of give us some insight into what the Chinese Navy policy guys are doing now as a result of their experience and their thoughts about the war in the Pacific.
Well, that's a book published by Naval Institute Press about Chinese naval strategy. The two part of it, the first part, near sea defense, second part, far sea protection. So they believe that China has been fighting ground war, land war, no more. No, going to Asia, going to ocean, and next war going to be a naval war. So they put too much and emphasize as well as the budget on their naval development, and they built 3 aircraft carriers in the recent years. So that's the topic for the book. Thank you.
Oh, we have a virtual audience question.
Were comfort women used for medical experimentation or other purposes besides sex?
I honestly don't really know the answer. I know prisoners of war were, and different ethnic groups in Indonesia. They had quite a horrible typhus experiment, killed many Indonesians. I don't know the answer, but it's not out of the question.
Okay.
I was just going to add in that connection. The most infamous instance of this is this Unit 731, which operated a number of locations in China, and they conducted experiments, and we don't really know the total number of deaths that resulted from that because the Japanese kept starting over from one and counting these prisoners they called logs that they conducted experiments on. The experiments were equally as horrifying as anything that Nazi Germany did. When you read these accounts about how they infected people and slowly watched them die, it's just unbelievably graphic about what happened. That whole aspect about Japan's war is one that took quite a while to come out because we collaborated with the Japanese after the war to get supposedly their results from their experiments on human beings. Not a very edifying chapter in our history. I can draw parallels to certain things, other things we did during the war with our collaboration with the Soviets. But in any event, this type of medical experimentation is yet another chapter of Japan's war across Asia.
Adding on to Mindy's about the comfort women, I was just explaining to two of the ladies there that I believe that there were different groups of women. You had the comfort women who were kidnapped and raped, and that was very common also in the Philippines. There was also the regular prostitutes who were paid and they were willing. Then there's another group of women who sacrificed themselves to be spies, wherein they became girlfriends of Japanese officers to be able to get intelligence and give it to the guerrillas, who would then send it over to Australia. So there were various different groups of women at that time, and like she said, also there were some in the front line, and probably experimented on with 731. Now, I just wanted to add also that I have seen pictures of, after the war, the MacArthur was very concerned about his men because they were coming in from New Guinea and then straight to the Philippines to fight. So he was concerned. It was the first time they were going to fight in cities, and they haven't seen a woman in over 6 months. So what he did was he set up prophylactic clinics in Manila. There are photos of that, and it says prophylactic clinics. But these women were willing women. They weren't kidnapped or raped or stuff. So probably, maybe they were prostitutes already. And they were managed in the sense that they were regularly examined for diseases. But they were for the military.
We have a question in the back.
Yes. I think earlier Rich referred to our perspective on World War II as having been very Eurocentric in the past. And as we look forward into how the powers in the world are realigning, how do we look at reinterpreting the impact of World War II through more of an Asian perspective? And what does that mean in terms of interpreting the cultural differences that we have to overcome to understand how we can deal with, for instance, the reversal of power, Japan versus China in today's world versus World War II, and how do we as Americans and Japan's allies, how do we help to overcome the lack of understanding, I guess I would say, from a cultural standpoint, of how we can equalize the power in the world?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, to say the least. Let me start out with some little background. What I find interesting, because one of the things I've been doing in the process of this trilogy I'm working on, I've been reading the New York Times day by day through the entire war. It's a tremendous perspective. It was the leading American paper, and in fact was the template that many other media outlets followed. The news of the day was what the agenda set by the New York Times. So if you go back and you read the New York Times, you find out that at the time, the war and in the Pacific, as we call it, and in Asia or whatever, it was not entirely neglected. Far from it. It was, it was really highlighted. And one of the most important aspects about that was that when Japan's war in China began in full tilt in 1937, the initial impression in the U.S. and the reporting was that, well, basically for almost 100 years, about 98 years, the Chinese central government, no Chinese central government had been able to sustain a war against a westernized power for more than a few months or a year. And so everyone expected that as soon as the Japanese got enough boots on the ground in China, the war would be over. Well, lo and behold, of course, Chiang and the coalition he led, including the communists, they sustained resistance and tied down the Japanese, even though they lost a lot of territory to the Japanese. And by the end of 1938, we know now from evidence we have from Japan that we never saw before, that by the end of October, November 1938, at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, they concluded they could not they could not achieve a victory over China by military means alone. So they switched to using political strategies like creating a rival government, and they also launched an extremely effective long-term economic war against the Chinese government, which had truly devastating effects. And the ability of the Chinese government and that war coalition that Chiang led was severely crimped in terms of its ability to do anything. First of all, because they lost outside contact, and secondly, because the economy simply was not there. Or there wasn't money to support a major war effort, and everything spiraled down, particularly with rampant inflation. Well, this was covered at the time, and American people, by the time of Pearl Harbor, the American people simply watching the news coverage of what was going on in China, both print and particularly video, had worked up a very high state of attention, which is amazing because there were very few people of Chinese descent that lived in the U.S. at that time. And from a sort of indifference of 1937, by February 1940, the American people, when a polling was asked, who do you favor in the war? And they came out 2% for Japan and 77% for China. So I would emphasize that even before Pearl Harbor, the American people were in a very high state of ire over what Japan was doing in China. And in fact, as historian David Kennedy points out, if you want to explain how the U.S. got into World War II, he said you can answer it with one word, and that word is China. That was really what got the U.S. into the war. And without China, I'm not sure when the American public would have been prepared to enter World War II at all. Now, we went into a period after World War II, however, in which the Eurocentric view about what was going on, mainly because of the Cold War, became so dominant that what we call the Pacific phase of the war not only took second place, it took a very distant third or fourth place. And it's only been more recently that we have had a lot more access to materials. We really have a much better story about what China's war was really like on both sides of all sides of the lines, and also between Taiwan and China. And that history now is building, and because of the international situation we now face, where we've got India and China as major players, it seems to me that it's appropriate now that we give a lot more attention to that phase of the war. I'm not saying it should displace our memory about the war in Europe, but certainly it deserves a much, much higher place in our national memory that it has enjoyed for decades.
So this is this question is directed towards Ms. Vallejo and Mr. Frank. We heard a lot about how Japan and China sort of their collective memories of the Pacific War. How does the conflict sort of fit into these countries like the Philippines and India, where right after the war, independence they gain independence? Does it sort of like fit into that as like the lead up to independence, or does it get sort of forgotten by their independence?
Independence of the Philippines from the United States. Okay. So how Japan's treatment of the Philippines after independence from the United States?
How the Philippines, like in their collective memory, how do they see the Pacific War and World War II? Like, does it sort of go along with the independence, or does it get overshadowed by independence?
Probably overshadowed by independence, the U.S. The independence the U.S. gave in 1946. So actually right now, I see a lot of monuments or markers in the Philippines, which I think we should create more of them and maintain them. But I think the war was so, I guess, affected the Filipino people so much that they just welcomed the U.S. independence just to be on their own. And the collective memory is to sort of like wipe out any of the atrocities or whatever the bad stuff that happened during the war. They just want to remember the good things, the good things about the war. And usually it's the peacetime, which was before the war, which is what they want to remember.
Well, with respect to India, let me make up for my faux pas earlier, whatever. This book by Sinrath Raghavan called India's War is really a breakthrough volume on India's participation in World War II and the effects of it. I highly recommend it. In terms of publications in the West, India's participation in the war was underserved for decades and decades. It's really only been more recently we've had some really excellent scholarship on it. Clearly, in terms of getting to independence, the war was absolutely central to getting India free by 1947. I really don't think you can really dispute that. Now, whether it had to be in 1947 or whether a more gradual process could have been implemented that could have avoided some of the tremendous and horrifying ethnic strife that was occasioned by what many regard as this rushed independence in 1947 is a separate question. My sense from my contacts is that for the general population in India, I don't think the Second World War plays that bigger role in terms of their consciousness of how they got to where they are. They regard the struggle that was led by Indian nationalists against the British as being more central to the narrative. But in terms of historians I deal with, they see it as an extremely important and a vital aspect about the Indian history, and they're trying to make their countrymen far more aware of how important the whole Asia-Pacific War was in their history.
There's a lot of discussion about the liberation of concentration camps in Europe and POW camps in the existing literature. Are there any examples of American GIs liberating any of the comfort houses?
They did, but no one thought enough to really write about it or basically look. There's one famous example in Burma where American GIs and Nisei interpreters stumbled upon a group of Korean women in Burma, and that's one report that everyone has found, and the Japanese will say that's proof positive they were prostitutes because the young men that interviewed them didn't know what they had found, and they put it in the terms they understood. Indirectly, there was liberation of the conversation, and of course there was liberation of the POW camps, and sometimes that was difficult with the POW camps because the list the Japanese gave MacArthur was a fraction of the POW camps. So in fact, one of the greatest liberation of women was an accident. There was a group of women of 18 Australian nurses, one British plantation owner, and this poor elderly lady from the Aleutian island of Attu who lived in Attu with the Native Americans and her husband, who the Japanese beheaded in front of her. And then they took her to Yokohama, and no one knew they were in Yokohama starving, and they just happened to be watching MacArthur's entourage go by with all the trucks and such, and someone noticed there's 3 white women standing by the road. Where did that come from? And so they were soon liberated, and none of them talked also about whether they were abused. Knowing the history, it's hard to imagine, but it's also not hard to imagine that they would not talk about it. The Australian women, there was many Australian women in the internment camps, in POW camps in Indonesia, and they agreed, the survivors agreed, we will never talk about this again. But if I can say one more story, you should go online, and just about a month ago, Vivian Bullwinkle, nurse Vivian Bullwinkle, became the first woman statue on the Australian War Memorial grounds. There's never been a statue there for a woman. And for those of you who do not know who Vivian Bullwinkle is, she was among 65 nurses that were put on a variety of boats to flee Singapore when the Japanese invaded. The Japanese, of course, blew these tiny little boats out of the water, and the survivors washed up on shore on something called Bangka Island, in different parts of the island. She was in a part with 22 nurses and some British soldiers who were been wounded. The Japanese immediately came upon them, machine gunned the soldiers, took the women and lined them up, because the women were wearing military uniforms, or what was left of their military uniforms, and lined them up in the ocean and machine gunned them down. She only got a bullet through her thigh and passed out and survived, but eventually had to become recaptured and put in a horrific POW camp. But what this story, which is what they like to talk about in Australia, doesn't say, they raped all the women beforehand. And the record from the POW camp showed that she had syphilis and most likely miscarried. And she was testified at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and talked about the Bangka Island massacre, where they machine gunned them, and said she had put in a whole page about how they were raped beforehand. The Australian government, by the request of the US government, said, take that out. And she had to take it out. And she didn't talk about it again until before she died.
So we did have a question in the back that we almost missed.
Yes, this is directed to Mr. Frank. As we know, China for centuries was a very powerful country, and then they looked inwards and shut off the rest of the world. And at a certain point in time, when the Western powers basically took advantage of that, and for all intents and purposes, decided to split up and share the China for their own benefits. And so for all those succeeding years, China has lived under this humiliation experience, and it's only been in the fairly recent, 100 years or less, where China started to open up again and flex its muscles. And Mr. Frank, with what has been developing over the last 10 to 5 years, even last year, China's becoming bigger and bigger, mighty, military, economic, and all that stuff. What would you share, please, your learned perspective of what is in store for the rest of the world with a China that is basically an awakened dragon and aware of what it's capable of doing, and basically just doing whatever it wants to do, wherever it wants to do it? I mean, what's in store for us? Can your crystal ball, could you share with us what your crystal ball would say?
Well, my crystal ball needs a lot of polishing to answer a question like that. Let me just say this, clearly there's ample reason for concern about what we're dealing with the PRC now. I would simply highlight the fact that, just within very recent times, since 1980, there's been, as Dr. Lee pointed out, there's been many changes in terms of the orientation of the Chinese government. We went through a period of what seemed to be more like international cooperation, and then with the current regime, it's turned more inward. One of the huge problems we have is we have very poor understanding of what the internal dynamics are among the Chinese leadership. And since we don't know that, it's awfully hard to project exactly what the future is going to hold with respect to them. We don't even know, although Xi seems to be very powerful and in control. There's been a lot of instability just literally within the last month or so in terms of very high-ranking Chinese officials being removed from office, which suggests there's some sort of turmoil going on within the leadership. But again, we don't really know whether Xi is totally in control and he's simply eliminating some people who were dared to speak up against him, or whether there's something deeper that's going on there. And the other thing is, that China's economy now is in a sort of a very perilous state. And one of the things I really worry about is, what a regime might do to sort of distract the Chinese people from their domestic woes with some sort of a overseas adventure. But honestly, I don't know. I don't know anyone who really knows, and we're all just sort of trying to pool our ignorance in terms of predicting what the PRC is going to do.
I totally agree, and that's what the discussions are on. Some people think some of the fear of China is overblown. There's many cracks in the Great Wall than we give it credit for, and we don't really know. We might be overestimating it. The Japanese definitely think we're overestimating it. And frankly, 3 aircraft carriers don't do very much. That's 3 obsolete aircraft carriers don't do very much. It's very easy. You can't have, this is not the era of aircraft carriers. So we have to be watching the Chinese economy, and China today is much more intertwined with the world economy, the world environment, the world finance, world science and technology. The most number of patents are coming out of China, inventions. They can't afford to be cut off. They can't afford to be as hostile as we are interpreting it. And we can't be, though we can't afford to be off guard, we maybe should be careful not to overestimate it.
Yep, right over in the middle.
Hi. My question is for Ms. Vallejo. I was wondering, for your book, what sources you utilized, since it was kind of as you talked about, more of a secret mission type of thing. I was wondering what sources you used, whether it was like oral histories or any type of diaries or anything like that. Thank you.
The places I went to was the MacArthur Library, the U.S. National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and there's the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Military History Institute. Then the best part was the after-action reports that I was able to gather. I wish there was an incident where in some of those after-action reports that the men wrote afterwards were destroyed. It was just inadvertently an accident. Somebody did not know the value of it. And then some of the men could have also written more after-action reports, but they had already gone on other assignments. The men were coming and going at that time. Then there were also the children, the children of the men. A lot of them, they had the stories. Sometimes their father, it would be their father or grandfather would tell the story. They'd write it down. Some did not write down. Some of the men did write about their experiences, but majority of the men did not want to write about their experiences. So all the children said was they didn't want to talk about it. But they always wondered why some of their fathers would have these nightmares, wake up screaming. They suffered still from some of the jungle rots and things of that sort, and the sickness that would keep recurring, and so on. So that's how kind of I gathered my material, and so they were scattered all over the place. Especially the secret missions was really hard to find. That one, the regiments. Well, you'd find something on that, and there was already a thesis done on it. It was a framework that I started on the regiment. But the secret missions were very difficult to find. Even in the Philippines, when I started, I would ask about the Filipinos who came from the United States before the war, before MacArthur arrived. nobody knew, they wouldn't believe me. They said, no, MacArthur arrived. MacArthur came, that's it. I said, well, I guess I know where I'm going to go next. So, yeah.
Let me make a commercial here for the Nimitz, if I may. You know, I've been to a lot of museums around the world and see their exhibits with respect to the Asia-Pacific War. And one thing in which Nimitz literally is the leader of the pack is that they were very fortunate to have a generous donor who wanted to add a whole section about China and China's role leading up to World War II and in World War II. And Mike Hagee and his staff were, very receptive to that and put that in. So this is the only museum I'm aware of that really begins to properly place China in perspective with respect to its role in what we've called the Pacific War or the Asia-Pacific War in World War II. So when you go through this museum and its galleries or whatever here, it's the one place you can go where the story really is complete with respect to the role that China had in this whole Asia-Pacific War.
Is that fine?
Yeah, I may regret asking this question actually, but so I'm kind of thinking back. So to Frank, when you started off, you said you want to keep in mind the shared humanity of everyone in the war. And of course, we've spent the last 6 hours or so, kind of commenting and documenting a lot of the atrocities of the Japanese military in the Asian War. And I'm wondering, I'm afraid we've lost the humanity of the Japanese soldiers. And I'm wondering, kind of again, Vallejo, you said that stories matter, right? Can any of you maybe comment on some stories of the humanity of the average Japanese soldier or sailor who, no one's denying that they participated in these atrocities, but I guess I personally know people who are not necessarily defined best by the actions that we most know their organizations for. And I feel I'm kind of curious if there's kind of some more commentary that we could make on that.
Oh yeah, there were some good Japanese in the Philippines. I noticed that most of the Japanese, that there would be good stories about them, that they were kind, they were benevolent, and they sometimes, like one of them that saved a whole village. When they knew that that village was going to be eradicated, they would warn them so that the village could leave. These men were some as officers, and I find out that most of them, they were educated in the United States. So they had that bond, you would say. So I was pleasantly surprised when I found that out. Most of them who were kind had been educated in the United States. So.
You're right. The Japanese were kind and good and can be decent. What happens when you have a fascist militaristic state that has expectations? Bad things are encouraged and rewarded and happen. There are quite a number of memoirs. So one of the things the conservative nationalists, that's the term of art for political scientists and regarding the Japanese right wing, are trying to correct all the memoirs, all the stories, books, autobiographies, at post-war, talk about how awful the battles were, how bad decision-making by the officers, which ended up leaving soldiers and sailors starving, where they had to revert even to cannibalism, had forced them to do things that they didn't want to do. So the conservative nationalists are fighting the memories of the real soldiers. And until relatively recently, there was a museum for the Siberian internees that Russians took hundreds of thousands of Japanese for years to do basically slave labor in Russia. And there used to be a museum for the wounded soldiers and how they were taken care of or not taken care of, because the soldiers didn't get enough compensation. They weren't respected enough. So this backwards movement in the late 1990s and in this century, they're trying to create this fanciful history. There is in English, and I might recommend for the bookstore to get it, a 3-volume manga about the war. And it's not, they don't, the Japanese author did not sugarcoat it.
Well, let me just point out here. When I did my book Downfall in 1999, I wouldn't have articulated the way I do now about, counting all the dead and treating all the dead as sharing common humanity. But I was very conscious of the fact that when I was writing this book, I wanted to make it very clear about what had happened to the Japanese. And I began the book with this really graphic entire chapter on the fire raid on the night of March 9th, 1945, which killed upwards of maybe 100,000 Japanese, overwhelmingly civilians. I had another section which was extremely graphic about what it was like to be on the ground in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It was so graphic that in one of the other books on the literature about this, which reached very different conclusions from what I did, but when they wanted to illustrate just how awful it was, they used my section because of its graphic description of how awful it was. And to a large extent, what I'm doing now is I'm trying to, again, not only put in the numbers, which I had in Downfall, but I didn't have the individual stories, which have a tremendous multiplying effect in terms of our graphic understanding of these things. And I've been very conscious as I've been going through this, looking for stories about, for lack of a better, good behavior by Japanese officials, by Japanese soldiers. And I found some, and I've woven those in. You had, for instance, during the Bataan Death March, we had conduct all over the lot in terms of the behavior of the Japanese soldiers regarding the prisoners of war. There were people who were very reasonable and treated people, and people who just did unbelievable, horrific things or whatever, juxtaposed side by side. That went. But one thing I've noticed going through this, it's just astonishing the degree to which you will find wherever the Japanese army went, terrible things were done. It was like, it's just like part of the scenery. Everywhere they go, they do these horrible things, even when they're winning. They are conquering in 1941 and 42. They still do god awful things. It's just what I've been writing is it brought home to me that this sort of monster that was the Imperial Japan, and even though there were good Japanese or whatever here, they're definitely in the minority.
Rich, when you're counting deaths, I'm curious as you go on to the end of your trilogy, are you tempted, or at some point do you start including tens of millions of deaths under Mao as part of the result of what's happened here?
Well, that's a very interesting question about what you get into in terms of what the consequences of the war are. I mean, clearly, one of the consequences was the triumph of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. And, anyone who's familiar with the accounts of Mao's reign knows that, there were episodes when we're talking about mega deaths. And we had disputes about just exactly how many there were and what the circumstances were in some cases, but you're dealing with, extremely large numbers of deaths, and that's part of the story. But it's, one of the things that Mindy talked about, one of the stories about the war that has been totally submerged is the fact that in August 1945, when the Japanese overran Manchuria, they captured, according to historian John Dower, they captured between 1.6 and 1.7 million Japanese nationals, just about half and half. At least it seems as though it was half and half military personnel and civilians. When the repatriation was finally complete years after the end of the war, by Japanese count, there was only 1.2 million Japanese nationals who've been returned. And we know from a work by Andrew Barchet of University of California, who found Soviet archival documents showing that about 61,000 Japanese military personnel died or disappeared in Soviet captivity. They were captured in Manchuria. Well, that tells you basically that if Dower's numbers are right, somewhere between 340,000 or almost 340,000 and 440,000 Japanese civilians died in Soviet hands in the period between August 1945 and for several years thereafter. And this is more than, I believe this is probably more than atomic bomb deaths. And that's been, almost totally erased from history.
So I believe we are out of time for questions. I'm very sorry. But I do want to thank all of our speakers for taking a moment to talk about this at our roundtable. I think it really helps kind of connect everything and drive it all home. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic back over. He has his own mic. I'm just going to let David use his mic. Thank you.
All right. We have certainly learned a lot today from our guest speakers. Our mission here at the National Museum of the Pacific War is to engage and inspire present and future generations with the stories of World War II and the Asiatic Pacific Theater and the continual relevance of its lessons. And I think we did that today. Thank you.